Have you ever been erased from your own family's story? Not because of anything you did, but because of who you chose to become. I was 32 years old when my mother called to tell me I wasn't welcome at my brother's wedding rehearsal dinner. Not the wedding itself, just the dinner, as if removing me from one night would somehow make everything easier for everyone else. Lena, she said, using that tone she's had my whole life, the one that makes you feel like you're already in the wrong before she's finished the sentence. Leonard's fiance's family is very particular. Her father is on the city council. You know how these things are. I knew exactly how these things were. I'd known my whole life. My name is Lena Hargrove. I'm a trauma nurse. I work 12-hour overnight shifts at St. Augustine Medical Center in Chicago, and I do it because I'm good at it, because it matters, and because the version of me who grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Naperville with parents who thought a stable life meant marrying young and never asking too many questions needed somewhere to put all of that hunger she felt but couldn't name. I found it in medicine. I found it in the middle of the night when someone's world is falling apart and the only thing standing between them and the worst outcome is whoever is calm enough to hold steady. I've been holding steady my whole life. My brother Leonard is 3 years older than me. Growing up, he was the golden one, varsity lacrosse, student council president, the kind of son my parents could point to at church without lowering their voices. He's a financial advisor now, which in my family translates to successful, and he got engaged last spring to a woman named Petra, whose father does, in fact, sit on the Naperville City Council. I've never begrudged Leonard any of it. What I've had a harder time accepting is the way my family learned to see me as the rough edge, the one who complicated things. It started when I was 24 and told them I wasn't going to finish my business degree, that I'd been accepted to an accelerated nursing program, and I was going. My father's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It just went blank. Not angry. Blank. Like he was recalculating something in his head and the numbers weren't coming out right. Nursing, my mother had said, not unkindly, but with that particular kind of disappointment that comes wrapped in concern, so you can't quite call it out. You know that's not, it's a hard life, Lena. What she meant was, it's not the life we imagined for you. It's not the kind of life you bring to a dinner party. I went anyway, and then, because apparently one transgression wasn't enough, I stayed single, not because I was unhappy or unlovable or any of the things I could see them worrying about in quiet conversations they thought I wasn't hearing. I stayed single because I was building something. I was finishing my degree, taking extra certifications, working my way from a general floor to the trauma unit because that's where I felt most useful. I had a small apartment in Wicker Park that I loved. I had friends who understood why I sometimes showed up to brunch, still in scrubs. I had a life that looked nothing like what they'd planned for me and felt completely, entirely mine, but none of that translated at family dinners. Lena's still at the hospital, my mother would say, when people asked after me. Not, Lena's doing really well, or Lena just got promoted to charge nurse. Just still. Like nursing was a phase I was working through. I stopped going home as often after my 31st birthday, when my aunt pulled me aside at a cousin's graduation party and said, in a whisper that wasn't really a whisper, "Your parents just want to see you settled, honey. Is there anyone special?" And when I said no, not right now, she patted my hand in a way that made me feel like a project. So by the time Leonard's rehearsal dinner came around, I hadn't been to a family event in about 8 months. I'd missed Easter. I'd missed my parents' anniversary dinner. I'd sent cards, texted, called when I could, but I'd pulled back because every time I showed up, I left feeling like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. When my mother called about the rehearsal dinner, I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage after a 14-hour shift. It was 11:30 at night. I had a cold coffee in the cup holder, and my scrubs felt like they'd been on me for a week. Her family has a certain image to maintain, my mother continued. And with the council connections, Leonard just thinks it might be easier if I'm not there. Silence. It's just the rehearsal dinner, Lena. You're still invited to the wedding. I sat with that for a second. The parking garage hummed around me, fluorescent and indifferent. Does Leonard know you're calling me? We talked about it together. Okay, I said. Okay, Mom, and I hung up. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I sat in that garage for probably 20 minutes, and what I felt wasn't grief exactly. It was something older and colder than grief. It was recognition. The understanding that this had always been the shape of things, and I'd just been hoping it would change. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday night at a restaurant called the Glenbrook in downtown Naperville, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a sommelier who explains the wine list without being asked. I know it well. I'd driven past it 100 times. It's 3 blocks from the coffee shop where I used to study in college. I didn't plan to go. I really didn't. What changed was a text from my cousin Becca. Not a malicious text, just an oblivious one, that said, "Rehearsal dinner tonight. So fancy. Wish you could be here," with a photo of the table settings, white roses, candles, my parents smiling in the background. Leonard in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I got in the shower, did my hair properly for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, and put on the one dress I owned that was built for exactly this kind of room. It was navy, floor length, a thing I'd bought 2 years ago for a hospital gala and worn exactly once. It still fit. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself, which was either a good sign or a bad one, and I decided not to analyze it. I drove to the Glenbrook. I want to be clear about something. I was not going there to make a scene. I wasn't going to cry, or confront anyone, or ruin Leonard's rehearsal dinner. I was going because I am his sister, and I had decided, somewhere on the drive between my apartment and that parking lot, that I was done letting other people decide what I was and wasn't allowed to attend in my own family. The hostess at the front confirmed there was a private event. I gave her my name. I said I was Leonard Hargrove's sister. She smiled, checked something, and said, "Of course, they're in the back room." I walked through the restaurant. I heard my mother before I saw her, that specific laugh she does when she's networking, bright and slightly too loud, the one that means she's on. And then I came around the partition into the back room, and everything sort of rearranged itself. It was a long table, maybe 20 people, warm light, the smell of garlic and wine. Leonard was at the far end with Petra, who is perfectly nice and not at all responsible for any of this. My parents were on the left side. Petra's father, a man I'd seen on local news coverage but never met, was holding court at the near end of the table mid-story. And sitting 2 seats to his right, leaning back in his chair with a glass of red wine, wearing a jacket with no tie in a room full of ties, was Dr. Elliot Rowe. Dr. Elliot Rowe. Elliot Rowe, who is the chief of emergency medicine at St. Augustine, my boss. Technically 3 levels above me in the hospital hierarchy, though we'd worked closely enough over the past 2 years that the distance had collapsed into something more like mutual respect. He was the one who'd recommended me for the charge nurse position. He'd written my last 2 performance reviews himself, which almost never happens at that level. 6 months ago, after a particularly brutal night involving a 6-car pileup and a staff shortage, he'd told me in the elevator that I was the best nurse on his floor, and he meant it. I had absolutely no idea he was going to be here. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. His eyebrows went up just slightly, the controlled version of surprise that surgeons and ER doctors train themselves into, and then a small smile. The story, I would learn later, was this. Dr. Rowe and Petra's father had gone to Northwestern together. They'd stayed close. When Petra mentioned that her fiancé's family was from Naperville and that his future brother-in-law was a physician, Dr. Rowe had been curious enough to accept the dinner invitation. The brother-in-law, of course, was not me. I'm not a physician. I'm a nurse. But Dr. Rowe knew exactly who I was. My mother saw me about 3 seconds after Dr. Rowe did. I watched her face go through about 4 distinct phases in rapid succession. Shock, then the particular kind of social horror that overrides regular horror, then a desperate attempt to recalibrate. "Lena," she said, in a voice that had all the warmth of a smoke alarm. "Hi, Mom." I found an empty seat near the end of the table. There were a couple, the dinner not yet fully seated, and sat down. Petra's father paused his story. He looked over at me with a pleasant but assessing expression of a man who was used to understanding power dynamics in a room before he continues speaking. It was Dr. Rowe who spoke first. Hargrove, he said. He always called me by last name, which I'd never minded. I didn't know you'd be here. I'm Leonard's sister, I said. Something shifted slightly in the room. Not dramatically, just shifted. Wait, Petra's father said, looking between us. You two know each other? Doctor's father said, looking between us. You two know each other? Rowe set down his wine glass. Lena is my charge nurse in the trauma unit. She's the reason our department's patient outcome scores have been in the top 10% statewide for the past 2 years. I don't think anyone at that table had ever heard anyone say something like that about me. I know I'd never heard it said out loud in front of my family. My father had gone very still. My mother was gripping her wine glass. Leonard was looking at me from the far end of the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not shame, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to see. Petra's father extended his hand across the table. I'm Warren, he said. I've been hearing about the work St. Augustine's trauma unit has been doing. Elliot speaks highly of the team. Thank you, I said. It's good work. Hard nights, but good work. What kind of cases? He asked, and he was genuinely asking, not making conversation, actually curious. So I told him, not to perform, not to prove anything to anyone at that table, but because he asked and because I know my work and because trauma care, when you explain it to someone who's actually listening, is remarkable and brutal and worth knowing about. I told him about the protocols we'd implemented for mass casualty preparation. I told him about the pediatric trauma certification our unit had just completed. I talked for maybe 3 minutes total. When I finished, Petra's father nodded slowly. My granddaughter was in the ER at St. Augustine last winter, he said. Febrile seizure. She was fine, but that team was extraordinary. I remember thinking the nurse who handled the initial assessment was exceptional. He paused. Was that your unit, overnight trauma team? Yes. That would have been us. He nodded again. Then he looked down at the table toward my mother, and I'm not sure what he intended by it. It might have been completely innocent, but my mother's face did something I will carry with me for a long time. Dinner moved on. People talked. Wine was poured. At some point, my brother came down to the end of the table and sat in the empty chair next to me, and we talked quietly for a few minutes. The first real conversation we'd had in months. He said he was glad I came. He said it like he meant it, and I believe he did. People are complicated. Leonard is not a villain. He's just someone who learned to do what would make things easier, and at some point he decided that meant going along with what our parents wanted, without looking too hard at what it cost. I'm not interested in holding that over him forever. I'm also not interested in pretending it didn't happen. When dessert came, Dr. Rowe caught my eye from across the table, just briefly. The look said something like, "You didn't need me to do that, but I hope it helped." I gave a small nod back. After dinner, when people were standing and talking, my mother found me near the window. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "You should have told us," she said finally, "about what you've built." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about all the family dinners where I'd tried to say something about a patient I'd helped, a protocol I'd developed, a mentor who believed in my work, and been met with polite subject changes and quiet redirects. I thought about the word still. You never asked, Mom. It didn't come out angry. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. The kind of tired that comes from a long time of hoping something will change and finally, quietly, accepting that change if it comes, will have to start somewhere other than where it's always been expected of you. She didn't say anything after that. She just nodded once and moved back toward my father. I stayed for another hour. I talked to Petra, who was warm and sharp and told me she hoped I'd be at the wedding, and when she said it like she meant it for herself, not for appearances. I talked to Dr. Rowe about a new triage protocol he wanted to implement, right there next to a flower arrangement at Leonard's rehearsal dinner, because that's who we are. I talked to Becca, who hugged me like she hadn't seen me in years. I drove home along Route 59, the same road I drove in high school, past the coffee shop, past the park where I learned to ride a bike, past the church where I was told once by a well-meaning Sunday school teacher that girls who asked too many questions would have a harder time in life. Maybe she was right, but harder isn't the same as worse. I got home at midnight. I hung up the navy dress. I sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment with a glass of water and let the night settle around me. The next morning, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Warren, Petra's father. He'd gotten my number from Dr. Rowe. He said the city's public health committee was launching an initiative on emergency trauma preparedness and was looking for clinical voices with on-the-ground experience, and that Dr. Rowe had recommended me without hesitation. Would I be interested in joining the advisory panel? I sat there in my kitchen with my coffee going warm in my hands, and I thought about my mother on the phone in the parking garage. It's just the rehearsal dinner, Lena. I thought about the blank look on my father's face when I said I was going to nursing school. I thought about 8 years of family dinners where my work was still, where my life was a subject to be changed, where showing up felt like apologizing for existing. Then I typed back, "I'd be honored. Thank you." I went to the wedding 2 days later. It was a beautiful ceremony. Petra cried during the vows, which made Leonard cry, which made me cry too. Because regardless of everything, I love my brother and I wanted this for him. We danced. Our mother hugged me near the end of the night, longer than usual, without saying anything. I let her. Some things get said in silence. Some things just take longer to arrive than they should. I'm still working nights at St. Augustine. I still show up at family holidays sometimes, though I've learned to leave when I need to instead of staying until I've slowly disappeared. I joined the advisory panel. The first meeting is next month. My father called me last week. Not for anything in particular, just to talk. We were on the phone for 22 minutes, which is about 20 minutes longer than our usual conversations. He asked about my work. I told him. He listened. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, and some starts are enough. I still think about that parking garage sometimes. 11:30 at night, cold coffee, 14 hours of work on my body, and my mother's voice on the phone telling me, kindly, carefully, that I was a problem to be managed. What strikes me now isn't the hurt of that moment, it's how unsurprised I was. That's the thing nobody talks about when they tell stories like mine. The moment of exclusion rarely comes out of nowhere. It arrives at the end of a long road of smaller erasures. The subject changes, the polite redirects, the word still used like a quiet verdict. By the time someone finally says it out loud, you've already absorbed it so many times that your body just goes still and cold and recognizes it. I didn't go to that rehearsal dinner to win anything. I want to be honest about that. I went because something in me had decided, quietly and without drama, that I was done shrinking to fit a space that had never really been shaped for me. That decision, to simply show up and be exactly who I was, turned out to matter more than anything I could have planned or performed. I think about what it took to get to that room. Not the drive, not the dress. I mean the years. The nursing school application I sent in despite the silence on the other end of the phone. The overnight shifts I took when other people my age were building lives that looked more like what we'd been taught to want. The work I put into understanding not just procedures but people, what they need in the worst moments of their lives, how to be steady when everything around them is coming apart. None of that happened because someone believed in me first. It happened because I decided to believe in the work itself, and then I did it, over and over, until the work became undeniable. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not the vindication. That part was almost accidental. What mattered was the integrity underneath it, the choice to keep going with honesty, to do the job right, even when no one in my personal life was watching, to build something real instead of something impressive. When Dr. Rowe said what he said at that table, it carried weight because it was true. You can't manufacture that. You can only earn it, slowly, by being the kind of person whose actions and values line up even when there's no audience, and the clarity to know that, to understand what you're actually building and why, even when the people closest to you can't see it yet. That kind of self-knowledge is something you have to fight for. My family wasn't trying to hurt me. They were working with the map they had, but I had to be willing to read a different one, to trust my own sense of direction when every familiar voice was pointing somewhere else. I don't carry bitterness about any of it anymore. I carry the memory of that drive home on Route 59, the quiet apartment, the glass of water, the feeling of having shown up for myself in a room where I'd been told not to come, Some things only become clear in hindsight. The hardship wasn't the detour, it was the road.